What actually happens when decades of deep-seated animosity, revolutions, nuclear fears, and global power politics all collide? The conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States isn't just another political dispute scrolling across your newsfeed. It's arguably one of the most dangerous, high-stakes rivalries in modern history. We're looking at a 70-year conflict here, one that's continuously brought the world to the brink, and today threatens global stability itself. Okay, let's dive into this.
To really understand how we arrived at today's incredibly tense situation, we're going to untangle this complex geopolitical knot step by step. We'll cover when enemies were allies, the beginning of the shadow war, the proxy network, the nuclear flashpoint, the eruption of direct conflict, and finally, the global stakes in 2026.
Section 1. When enemies were allies, the surprising era of cooperation. It's a massive historical irony, but if we look back before 1979, the map of Middle Eastern alliances looked entirely different. Back then, Iran was ruled by the Shah, a pro-Western monarch. The United States actually viewed Iran as one of its absolutely strongest allies in the region. And incredibly, Iran and Israel were close partners. They openly traded oil, and they engaged in some highly secretive military and intelligence cooperation. Honestly, back then, nobody imagined these nations would become such bitter adversaries.
But of course, this alliance didn't just collapse out of nowhere. It all started with oil. In 1953, Iran's democratically elected prime minister nationalized the country's oil industry. Fearing the loss of control over those resources, the CIA and British intelligence basically organized a covert coup to remove him and restore the Shah's rule. For a lot of Iranians, this was undeniable proof of foreign control. That anger simmered for over 20 years until the dominoes finally fell in 1979. Millions protested, the Islamic Revolution erupted, the Shah fled, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. Iran officially became an Islamic republic. Let's move to Adas and see how this builds.
Section 2. The Shadow War begins. Revolution and rupture.
So we're now entering an era where alliances flipped literally overnight. The new regime in Iran immediately cut all relations with Israel, officially declaring them an enemy. And Washington? Washington was given a stark new label by the Islamic Republic, the Great Satan. Just in the blink of an eye, the U.S. went from greatest supporter to ultimate adversary.
And nothing cemented this permanent hostility quite like this staggering number right here, 444. Just months after the revolution, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. 52 American diplomats were taken hostage, and they were held captive for 444 consecutive days.
So, the crucial point is understanding how this single crisis is viewed through two entirely different, deeply entrenched lenses. From the American perspective, the world watched in shock. This was seen as a profound humiliation and a blatant, illegal act. But from the Iranian perspective, the takeover was framed as a necessary act of resistance, basically direct protection against any further foreign interference, just like they'd experienced back in 1953. This absolute deadlock in perspective permanently shattered U.S.-Iran relations, triggering decades of sanctions.
Section 3. The Proxy Network. Expanding the battlefield.
Following the revolution, Iran and Israel both realized a direct, all-out war would be completely devastating. So they spent decades carefully avoiding it. Instead, Iran chose to fight indirectly by developing what's called the Axis of Resistance. This is a vast network of supported armed groups spread across the Middle East, which allowed Iran to project regional power and oppose Israel and the U.S. without actually risking a war on its own soil.
When you look at the geographic spread of these groups, you really get a sense of how vast this shadow war became. We're talking about Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, various armed militias operating in both Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis down in Yemen. The conflict essentially expanded to cover thousands of miles, far, far beyond the actual borders of Iran and Israel.
But naturally, Israel didn't just sit idly by. They viewed this network as a massive security threat. So, Israel developed calculated step-by-step tactics to covertly dismantle this ring of proxies. They used highly targeted airstrikes, really sophisticated cyber attacks, deep intelligence operations, and even assassinations of key network figures. It became this deadly, quiet game of chess.
Section 4. The nuclear flashpoint, the race for enrichment.
Eventually, a new element was introduced that changed the math entirely, dramatically raising the global stakes. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute, terrifying deadlock regarding uranium enrichment.
The Iranian stance insists its nuclear activities are strictly peaceful, meant only for energy and scientific research. However, the Israeli and U.S. stance views this program as a covert weapons operation. For Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran is considered a literal existential threat.
This deep-seated fear created a total roller coaster of diplomacy and near misses. Back in 2015, there was a brief moment of hope when world powers and Iran signed the JCPOA nuclear deal, trading nuclear limits for sanctions relief. But that completely collapsed in 2018 when the U.S. withdrew from the agreement and those crushing sanctions returned. Then, by January 2020, the whole world collectively held its breath. The U.S. killed a highly powerful Iranian military figure, General Qasem Soleimani, in a drone strike. Iran immediately responded by firing missiles at U.S. bases. Global fears of a direct war exploded overnight, though remained just barely indirect, at least for a little while longer.
Section 5. Eruption of direct conflict. From shadows to direct strikes.
Well, that hesitation was bound to run out eventually. We're now stepping out of the shadows and into the most violent, volatile chapters of this history. The real catalyst for this massive shift was the 2023 Gaza war. Iran's continued support for Palestinian groups led Israel to massively intensify its attacks against Iranian-linked targets across the entire region. Those unspoken rules of the shadow war, they were suddenly breaking down. This breakdown culminated in what many have called the 12-day war across 2024 and 2025. For the very first time, Iran actually launched massive, direct drone and missile attacks from its own soil toward Israel. In retaliation, Israel directly struck Iranian military bases, commanders, and nuclear-related sites. A full-scale regional war was narrowly avoided, but the decades-old taboo of direct confrontation was entirely shattered.
Section 6. Global Stakes in 2026. The Economic Edge.
Which brings us right to the present day. The conflict has evolved yet again, and the stakes are no longer just regional, they're entirely global. The escalation this year has been rapid and incredibly dangerous. First, international reports note coordinated strikes by the U.S. and Israel on Iranian military infrastructure. Second, Iran retaliates heavily, targeting military bases with ballistic missiles. And third, and perhaps most terrifying for the global economy, Iran threatens the total disruption of the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this single number, 20%. It might seem like a kind of modest fraction at first glance, right? But in the context of the global energy market, it represents an immense, almost unimaginable volume of power. That 20% represents the slice of the entire world's oil supply that travels through the incredibly narrow Strait of Hormuz. This is the absolute vulnerability of the global economy. If this single geographic choke point is closed down due to conflict, global oil prices will absolutely explode. We're talking fuel shortages and economic chaos spreading worldwide, practically instantly.
Let's connect the dots here, because this is exactly why every single person watching should care about these rising tensions. The global ripple effect is just immense. We're looking at instant panic in global financial markets. We're looking at the total destabilization of worldwide shipping routes. There is an imminent risk of a wider war dragging in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and the Gulf nations. And overarching it all, the massive, catastrophic risk of a nuclear miscalculation. When superpowers, regional militias, and nuclear fears collide, a single mistake literally changes history.
We've traced over 70 years of coups, revolutions, shadow wars, and now direct military strikes. The pieces are all in motion, driven by history, but actively unfolding right now. I'll leave you to ponder the gravity of this final question. Will this conflict reshape the future of the Middle East and the world? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.